Okay, the final item of business is the members' business debate on motion 17910 in the name of Patrick Harvey on the future of Glasgow's bus services. The debate will be concluded without any questions being put. I'd invite members wishing to participate to press the requested speak buttons, and I invite Patrick Harvey to open the debate around 7 minutes. Mr Harvey.
Very happy to do so, Presiding Officer, and it's usual to begin by thanking those who've chosen to stay late for a members' business debate. I think I have a double reason to thank those who've chosen to stay late on the last day before our recess, so I'm grateful for those who've chosen to participate, and of course to those who've added their names in support of the motion. That included members of 4 political parties. I'm sorry we don't have them all represented in the chamber, but they are represented in support for the motion. Let me begin by talking about the state of Glasgow's bus services. If you stand at a bus stop in Glasgow, you will rarely hear anyone ask, when is the bus due, or check the timetable. Quite simply, most people know not to bother. People are much more likely to ask if the bus they want has been and gone. The idea of actually relying on the published timetable is largely a joke. Even at the few stops with electronic displays, the more typical experience is to watch as the minutes count down to the bus that you're waiting for, and then you roll your eyes as it disappears from the screen and never appears on the road. It's also a fragmented network with different routes covered by different operators who don't recognise each other's tickets. On a recent trip to a Glasgow hospital, for reasons I won't go into, nothing most men in their 50s haven't experienced, I will spare members the grisly details. But this is one of the public services that people need to rely on good quality public transport to be able to reach. I can honestly say that the task of planning and undertaking the multi-operator bus journey to get there was significantly more stressful than the medical procedure I was there for. Fares are simply ludicrous, with an all-day city ticket on first bus costing nearly £6, and bizarrely 2 single journeys costing even more than that. Nobody believes they're getting value for money. And that's before we even consider whether the routes that we need can be depended on. Just today, I saw an email from a constituent about another cancelled route, this time the 65, between the city centre and halfway in Cambuslang, which First Bus confirm they will end in just a few weeks' time. Presiding Officer, this system isn't working. Deregulation, privatisation and running public transport for profit has never worked for passengers. Now, I'm pleased that the Greens have made good progress in recent years on some important improvements, most significantly free bus travel for young people and asylum seekers. But the truth is that bus services in Glasgow and in much of Scotland stand no comparison with many other European cities and countries. And even in other parts of the UK, such as Manchester, dramatic progress has been made in recent years. Now, I was very amused today to see the rather childish name-calling from Sandy Easdale of McGill's in today's Glasgow Times ahead of this debate, claiming that Manchester's franchising has been a disaster. Well, let's take a look at some of the results of that disaster. Patronage increased by 14% year-on-year in the first franchising areas. Punctuality regularly exceeding the 80% target, that's compared to 66% pre-franchising. Better connected communities with more residents living within a 5-minute walk of a half-hourly service. More affordable fares, convenient integrated ticketing, cleaner and greener buses and a pilot of 24/7 bus services launched, reinstating nighttime services to the northwest of the city for the first time in a decade. And of course, the B network combines buses, trams, trains, walking, wheeling and cycling to create a seamless travel experience. Presiding Officer, this is the kind of disaster that Glasgow's bus services can only dream of. I want to recognise everyone who's put in tireless effort to campaign for a better bus service for Glasgow, notably Get Glasgow Moving, as well as the work of the STUC and others, who are building the case for change and pointing to the solutions. So what are those solutions? First stop, franchising. Franchising brings public control over routes, fares and service standards, things that are currently dictated by private operators. Franchising in the SPT area would be the first test case of the Transport Scotland Act 2019. But as well as being a slow process, that Act requires the plan to come under scrutiny by an independent panel convened by the Traffic Commissioner for Scotland. The equivalent legislation in England doesn't have that requirement. SPT have asked that the panel approval process be removed. A very simple bill here in Parliament could remove this unnecessary step. SPT also estimate that it could take 7 years to introduce a bus franchise. In the meantime, they plan to move ahead with a bus service improvement partnership. But I share the concerns of Get Glasgow Moving, who suggest that any use of the BSIP programme would delay efforts to establish the franchise. Yeah. SPT could avoid the BSIP route if the Scottish Government provided funding to accelerate franchising. But from there on, we need to go on to public ownership. Taking bus fleets and depots into public ownership would, in the first instance, give franchising real teeth. A franchising arrangement that leaves fleets and depots in the hands of private companies would be a half measure. According to STUC data, though, First Glasgow had a 10% profit margin, and that compares to 9.1% for Scotland's only publicly owned bus company, Lothian Buses. Lothian Buses returned a dividend of £36 million over the last decade. That's money that otherwise would have gone into the pockets of already wealthy people if this was a private service. Instead, this money is going where it should, back into improving the service that people are relying on. So, Presiding Officer, if we really want to redesign the network to improve frequencies and coverage, if we want to introduce flat, affordable fares or expand fare-free travel, if we want to create a unified information and ticketing system, in short, if we want to create a bus service that works for public interest and returns revenue to the public purse, then the next stop should be full public ownership under a municipal operator. That's the vision that we should be working to realise in Glasgow, and then for the rest of the country. Public transport as a public service. It can happen, but it needs Scottish Government support, investment and political will. Glasgow deserves world-class public transport.
Thank you, Mr Harvey. We now move to the open debate. I call first Claire Hawkey to be followed by Graham Simpson. Up to 4 minutes, Ms Hawkey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I'd like to thank Patrick Harvey for bringing this debate today, which has proven very timely for residents in my Rutherglen constituency. Because at its heart, this debate is about people, how our communities operate and thrive, and how they access services, employment, education and leisure. And our communities should have the assurance and the confidence that our bus networks are affordable, green and a reliable alternative to cars. Last week I received notification from First Bus that they are completely withdrawing the number 65 bus between Glasgow city centre and halfway in Cambuslang from service. The letter which I received about this cut stated that the withdrawal of the service would allow the company to, quote, improve timetables across other parts of Greater Glasgow. It also included a list of alternative journey options, which included the number 21 service. Since this announcement, my constituency office has been flooded with calls and messages from constituents who are deeply worried and angry about the proposals. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of them who have been in touch with me over the past week to share their concerns and experiences. Many of them have made the point that the number 21 service, one of the apparent alternatives, is also subject to service reductions with changes to its frequency and running times. Some have described the 65 service as a lifeline, which allows them to access vital services, including many disabled or elderly residents who are set to lose their only route to town centres. Others have told me that how they will now need to take 2 or 3 buses to get to their work, or face a long walk to a stop, either because their bus is disappearing altogether or having its hours drastically reduced. And at the same time, South Lanarkshire Council are cutting school bus services to around 8,000 school pupils. The number 65 bus was cited as an alternative means of getting to school in a letter to families in Cambuslang, and that is from August this year. As if it wasn't bad enough that they're losing their school transport, these families are feeling abandoned yet again. And it's not surprising that the idea that the removal of the number 65 is somehow positive news for Greater Glasgow as a whole has been met with much cynicism and anger in my constituency. I will.
Paul Sweeney.
I thank the member for giving way. She's making a very important point that there's no way to fully view the coherence of the Greater Glasgow bus system because the money about, or the information about what money routes make and what routes are losing money isn't available. And along with the control of the fare box with franchising, can we address that? Does she agree that ultimately franchising is the only solution to this problem?
Claire Hawkey.
Well, I'm actually going to come on to that very point later on in the speech. But long and short of it is yes. I met with First Bus yesterday to relay my own and my constituents' concerns about these changes, and I left them in no doubt of my opposition of the removal of this vital service, which links communities in my constituency like Springhall, Fernhill, Cathkin, Whittlesburn and Halfway together. And at my request, First Bus have now committed to undertaking further studies to see, should the 65 be withdrawn, whether alternative routes could be created instead to serve the communities that are going to lose out. Unfortunately, they advise this would not be a quick process and that nothing is guaranteed, and so I'll continue to do what I can to urge First Bus to maintain the number 65 route. One of my real concerns about this whole process is how constituents don't seem to have a formal role in opposing timetable changes or service cuts. And of course, they can lodge complaints or raise issues with their elected representatives. But I'd be keen to hear from the Minister when he sums up whether bus users themselves can play a more formal role in any changes proposed by bus companies and how we can actually make that happen. I've long supported and called for moving private bus services into public ownership in South Lanarkshire to avoid exactly the issues I've outlined impacting my community and to allow for joined-up thinking and planning about the network. Currently, bus services are at risk of service reductions and complete cancellations at relatively short notice and with little or no meaningful consultation. Under franchising, of course, these decisions would fall to a local transport authority and they would have a responsibility towards and be accountable to the communities they serve. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Hawkey. I now call Graham Simpson to be followed by Pam Duncan-Glancy. Around 4 minutes, please, Mr Simpson.
Yeah, I hope you can hear me. I'd like to start off by apologising to Patrick Harvey for not being there in person. I did my very best to make my diary work, but I just couldn't make it work. If Patrick is trying to intervene, I'm happy to allow him to intervene.
Patrick Harvey.
I'm grateful to Graham Simpson. I'd prefer to apologise to him. I wasn't aware that he was joining us online when I made my comment earlier, and I would just put on record the recognition for his long-standing interest in this issue.
Graham Simpson.
That's very nice of Patrick to say, and he's right. And we've worked together on this issue for a long time. There's been cross-party agreement on this, and I was very happy to sign his motion when it appeared. I'm really glad we've got the debate here today. Claire Hawkey was just expressing the frustrations that many of us have felt, really, over the years when bus services have been removed. I live in an area in East Kilbride where a bus service was removed some years ago, and it hasn't returned to what it was. I would describe the area that I live in as a bus desert, and so it's no wonder that most people, including myself, use cars where we'd much rather be able to use public transport. And I think this is why there are many of us in this Parliament who favour, in the Strathclyde region, going to a franchising model. The frustration, or one of the frustrations, though, is the time it is taking. It is taking far too long. The powers were introduced in the Transport Scotland Act 2019. The regulations have only just gone through, but it is going to be some years before, if it does go ahead, we actually see a franchising model rolled out across Strathclyde. And when I say across Strathclyde, I'm not talking about just Glasgow. I'm talking about all those places around Glasgow, such as East Kilbride, North Lanarkshire, South Lanarkshire, the Renfrewshires. These should all be part of an integrated transport system for Strathclyde. Now, I'm less hung up about who owns the buses than perhaps Patrick might be, but I think it needs to be under one badge and one body, probably SPT, running things, setting fares, organising the routes so that buses and maybe we'll get a light rail system. Maybe we'll get the Clyde Metro system that we're being promised at some point. Maybe it'll even be in my lifetime. I hope so. In essence, presiding officer, we need a better public transport system. And that is why people want franchising in Strathclyde. Now, the Minister, who will respond to this debate, has written to the NZEC committee. He doesn't seem in that letter to accept that things are taking too long. He doesn't seem to accept that there are problems, such as the one raised by Patrick Harvey earlier with the panel appeal process. That really needs to change. And I'm looking forward to speaking to the Minister very, very soon, next week, in fact, where I hope we can iron out some of these problems. Presiding officer, once again, I apologise for not being there in person. I really do. I prefer to do these things in person, but I'm glad we've had the debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Simpson. And I call Pam Duncan-Glancy to be followed by Mark Ruskell. Around 4 minutes. Ms Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I want to thank my colleague Patrick Harvey for bringing this important debate to the Chamber. I'd also like to thank the Presiding Officers for agreeing that I may leave before the conclusion of the debate, as I need to head back to Glasgow, and after the time changed I was unable to reschedule what I need to be back for. So I apologise to the Chamber and to colleagues and to Patrick Harvey, and I put on record that I will undertake to watch the Minister's contribution early within the next few days. People in Glasgow need affordable, reliable and environmentally sustainable bus services. The 2022 census reported that 9.3% of commuters in Glasgow use the bus as their main mode of transport when travelling to work. This is much higher than the national average. Furthermore, it should be noted that this only covers travel to work and doesn't include non-work trips, such as shopping, leisure or, of course, healthcare visits, as we've heard previously. And so the percentage of people who rely on buses across the region is likely to be far higher, particularly amongst the older population. And in fact, Glasgow Bus Alliance estimates that buses provide 75% of the public transport services in Glasgow, and they're an integral part of daily life. But this means that any changes to service provision have a wide-ranging impact. And we've heard already about First Bus 65 service, which runs from Glasgow to halfway, and how passengers on that service were told with less than 28 days' notice that their service was being withdrawn without consultation or engagement with passengers. The Transport Scotland Act requires bus companies to notify local authorities when they plan or vary or cancel a service, and in this case, First Bus notified SPT as the affected authority. However, there was no requirement for local authorities to be notified by either the bus operator or the Transport Authority. So although school routes are affected, at least in South Lanarkshire Council, as we've heard already, and First Bus and the Council were in active discussion over this, the company had no legal requirement to disclose the material change in circumstance to the Council. So this means that where there is a Transport Authority in place, there is no requirement for a bus operator to notify any affected local authority of a service cancellation, thus distancing the decision from democratic oversight. I'll take the intervention.
Claire Hockley.
I thank Pam Duncan-Glancy for taking an intervention on that very point, and as she heard in my speech, it's very much a hot topic. Is she aware if SPT did consult with South Lanarkshire Council?
Pam Duncan-Glancy.
I thank the member for taking that intervention, and it's my understanding that there's no requirement for them to do that, which means they could be left in a situation where there's no public accountability for actions that they're taking, which I think is a circumstance that neither of us think is acceptable, because of course we do need public accountability in that. In all cases, not having the legal requirement of bus operators to consult with the public on service cancellations, and no requirement to notify until after the cancellation has been confirmed, is difficult and removes public scrutiny. I'd be grateful then if the Minister could set out to the Chamber the ways in which the Transport Scotland Act has teeth and can be used to influence decisions by bus operators so that they are subject to appropriate scrutiny. For people who rely on the 65 service, the lack of consultation on this decision really is devastating. One resident said the service means everything to her, connecting her with outside life, and without it, she wouldn't be able to have the same quality of life. And this is exactly the impact that pooling services without having that democratic accountability can have on people's lives. Presiding Officer, I want to use the very short time I have remaining to mention travelling as a disabled woman on buses in Glasgow. And just to make the point on the record that whilst getting to a bus stop in Glasgow, as any person can experience, as Patrick Harvey has highlighted, is a very difficult situation because you don't know if a bus is going to come or not. But if you're a wheelchair user, you have an added lottery of whether or not the bus is going to be fully accessible or there's going to be someone else in the space. That makes it really difficult to travel around a city when buses might be the only accessible form of transport. Now, NASA have put disabled people on the moon in the last couple of years. I think it's far more, if they can do that, then I think bus authorities can help disabled people get across our great city. Am I able to take the intervention?
Give the time back, Mr. Duncan-Glancy. Patrick Harvey.
I think Pam Duncan-Glancy makes an extremely important point, and I assume she would agree that the experience in Manchester shows that the approach to genuinely showing ambition about the renewal of bus services, both infrastructure and vehicles, shows that a greater, more integrated approach to this can result in dramatic improvements to accessibility.
Pam Duncan-Glancy.
I thank Patrick Harvey for that intervention, and I wholeheartedly agree. And I know that my own experience, but the experience of other disabled people, having spoken to them, is far better and easier in Manchester. And with franchising, we have that opportunity to make buses more accessible, affordable, and address the frequency, so that they're in the right place at the right time to meet the needs of our constituents. I'm happy to take the intervention. And
Bob Doris.
I thank you for your indulgence, Presiding Officer, but I think it's a really important point Pam Duncan-Glancy makes. As a dad, I felt I've been competing with wheelchair users when I'm there with babies and buggies and prams, and there's a lack of understanding from the travelling public that there are specific spaces specifically for wheelchairs and similar mobility devices on buses that are not for prams, or not for buggies, or not for suitcases. Do you think we have to educate the general public more as well, Pam Duncan-Glancy?
Pam Duncan-Glancy, always through the chair.
I thank the member for that intervention, and I've been in awkward situations, as I'm sure the member has, or anyone who's got a wheelchair or a buggy. I find it regrettable that anyone has to get off the bus in that situation, if I'm honest, because we can design buses that have enough space on them for both. But I think it is important that the general public understand the difficulties that both groups of people have trying to get around the city, so that we can use the buses in Glasgow and get people around them. And on that, Presiding Officer, I'm over time, and I appreciate that you giving me that. So thank you very much, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. I now call Mark Ruskell to be followed by Bob Doris in 4 minutes. Mr.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I thank my colleague Patrick Harvey for bringing forward this motion for debate. Patrick has been a relentless champion for people in Glasgow and bus users in Glasgow now for many years, and it's great this debate has been brought forward at, I think, a really critical point here tonight. I'd also like to thank Get Glasgow Moving, who've been really successful in working in a genuinely cross-party basis across this Parliament. I've been very pleased to support their petition, which calls for a better process for establishing franchising in Scotland. And I really hope that the Minister's listening to this debate and that he recognises that cross-party concern about the process involved in decision-making around setting up a franchise, the length of time that it will take, the concerns that have been raised about the panel. And I hope you'll also note that, when that regulation was passed in this Parliament last year, it was really only passed on the basis that we had the DPO in the chair at the time rather than the PO in the chair at the time. It was on an absolute knife edge. Now, my inbox overflows with bus issues, and I have to say it's a real mixed bag. I get great feedback on the under-22s free bus pass. I get lots of people calling for it to be extended. But of course, that bus pass only works if you've actually got a reliable bus service to get on in the first place. And I have to say the majority of emails I get from constituents are about concerns about the quality and the state of our bus services. And I want to pay tribute to a constituent of mine, Valerie Brand, who has for years been campaigning for better bus services in her community, particularly the X10 Glasgow Balfron Stirling bus. Initially when it was run by First Group, and then when it was in recent years being run by McGill's. And Valerie has documented all of the issues over the years, the holes in the floors of the bus, the water that's been gushing in from windows, inaccessible buses, buses going on fire, an issue which led to a public inquiry from the Traffic Commissioner into McGill's, which concluded last year. And the poor services, the cancellations, the online apps not being updated, the drivers going past, request stops because because of the poor training of the drivers. And to be honest, in that community, when people want to know what's going on with the buses, they don't get in touch with McGill's. They just phone up Val. They go straight to Val and they ask her, what is going on with the buses today, Val? What's the latest chat on the buses? So really, to be honest, I would like to see Val running the bus services, certainly the X10, rather than private companies that are utterly unresponsive to public need. But, I'll settle for public bus services run in the public interest if Val isn't available to run them, because we need to have bus services that are listening to people, listening to everyday needs, and running responsive services. So I absolutely support the public franchising of bus services in Glasgow. I hope that will also have an impact, a positive impact on the X10 service. And I hope that SPT are able to make the right decision in September and to progress their case for that. But of course, across Scotland, there are lots of different types of public control. We have a situation, in the Trossachs with Loch Lomond Trossachs National Park, where we have a public body, the National Park, that's commissioning a new bus service between Callander and Aberfoyle, very successful, going into its second year. The Minister will be aware of the Octorada Town bus as well, I think in his own constituency, where a community body has commissioned a bus service. We have the situation in Glenfarg, where Stagecoach walked away from a bus service that I think was only getting about 10 or 12 passengers a day. Glenfarg Community Transport Group stepped up, and they're now running a 55 service that has 1,200 passengers a week. Absolutely incredible turnaround. 23 service running, attracting 600 passengers a week. And then in Stirling, we have Stirling Council taking an initial first step in taking over the C60 bus service and running a minibus between Killin and Callander. So there are lots of different models that can apply to Strathclyde, but into rural communities across Scotland as well. And ultimately, what we need is to run bus services in the public interest, but that needs the political will and the vision. We need to use that huge public investment in concessionary travel schemes and the network support grants to support public bus service that are run in the public interest. Let's get the investment right. Let's get the model right. Let's see public transport run in the public interest across the whole of Scotland, rural, urban, the whole of Scotland.
Thank you. I now call Bob Doris to be followed by Paul Sweeney. Up to 4 minutes, please, Mr Doris.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can I thank Patrick Harvey for bringing this motion to the Chamber this evening. It is an important one. For the substantial Scottish Government investment that we make to Scotland's bus services, we should be getting a far better service from our city's bus services in Glasgow. I think that's clear. Fares are too high and services are too sparse, particularly in the evenings, Saturdays and absolutely Sundays. Some places are bus deserts on a Sunday. We can do better. We need strategic investment into bus services, and I do believe that a franchising model under powers given to local authorities and transport organisations from the Scottish Government can mean that we will do better. And in Glasgow, that means coordination by SPT, of course. So what are some of the issues that I see in Glasgow? Well, Rockhill in my constituency barely has a service run through it. The 90 is thin gruel, quite frankly. The 8, which is a really valued service, doesn't exist from Springburn on a Sunday. And as it runs through Summerston, it's far reduced at nights and weekends. But the example I would like to give would be the lack of a bus service through Kelvindale. And I pick that particularly because sometimes it's managed decline by bus companies. So when First Glasgow, a few years ago, decided to take out the Kelvindale part of what was the 4A service, going from, I think, Broomhill through the west end of Glasgow and onward through the city centre, then what happened was they were left without a bus service. Now, SPT then, through my intervention and others, stepped in and an M4 service was put in place instead. Far inferior, but it's something. So we champion that as a win. It's not really a win, it's just not as bad as it otherwise would have been. Now, I've met with First Glasgow a couple of times recently to try and reinstate a service through Kelvindale, and of course they now point out that running a bus service through Kelvindale is not economically viable. Well, of course it's not, because you have to look at the end-to-end point in its entirety for a bus service. And if you break it up into component parts, no bus service is economically viable, but it's a public service that requires investment. And that's what franchising and coordination is all about. So we have to accept that this will cost money, and we need to make sure there's a parliamentary common purpose in relation to that. That investment needs a collective political will, not just across parties, but we are talking about Glasgow and the wider Greater Glasgow area, but across the country as well. Colleagues elsewhere in the country may not be championing the up to £80 million per year that this could all cost. Let's be realistic about it. We don't have that money right now, but we have to find it. Yeah.
Mr. Garvey.
I'm grateful to Bob Doris for the intervention here. He does make some important points. I would make the case, as I have done again, that other changes that we need to make in the transport system for climate purposes, such as road pricing, in whatever form it takes, need to be seen as a source of revenue for investment in public transport. But does Bob Doris also acknowledge the statistic I gave in my speech, that Lothian buses, already in the public sector, returns revenue to the public purse? It generates revenue, so it may cost some investment to get there, but once we're in that position of running bus services in the public interest, it can generate revenue that gets put back into public good.
Bob Doris.
Presiding Officer, can I just say I agree with all of that. I can't expand within the now 4 minutes that is now lapsing from my time allocation, but we have to get there first. So we have to will the investment to begin with before we can get there. In closing, Presiding Officer, I would like to point out we have to be clear, other than climate issues, of course, Patrick Harvey, why we want to franchise the buses. Well, we serve areas that's got the greatest unmet demand, areas with lowest car ownership, areas of low income, with deprivation, with social needs. We must not pretend that bus franchising will give everyone, as some people have done in the past, a bus outside their door to wherever they want to go to drop them off there, because that's what some people think. It's got to be strategic, it's got to be targeted, it's got to be coordinated, but it's also got to be funded, and that takes political will. And in the Chamber this evening, we have that political will. We have to share that across the Parliament also, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Doris. I now call Paul Sweeney to be followed by John Mason. Up to 4 minutes, Mr Sweeney.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I wish to also thank my colleague Patrick Harvey for bringing this motion for members' business, which I was pleased to sign, and also recognise the excellent work done by Get Glasgow Moving over the last decade or so of their work, along with the associated Better Buses for Strathclyde campaign, which I think have really driven the effort, public-spirited effort to improve bus services across our city. And I think the message goes out loud and clear to the government across the chamber of all those who are elected to represent the people of Greater Glasgow, that we demand speedy and immediate improvement to the regulations concerning bus franchising, so that we can get on with it without further delay. It's unacceptably slow and inadequate, and I hope that the Minister is hearing this, that there's a consensus across the region that the continued situation is unsustainable and is socially unjust. And I think that's the ultimate issue that's came across from the Chair. I enjoyed Mr Doris's remarks. I wish he'd had another minute to continue his comments, but I think it is ultimately coming back to this point. Social injustice is at the heart of this issue that we face in our bus system in Glasgow. Glasgow represents 20% of the Scottish economy, yet according to the Centre for Cities, it is underperforming economically compared to similar European cities by around £7 billion a year in terms of GDP. That's equivalent to the entire oil and gas industry in Scotland. It's another 4.5% onto Scotland's GDP if we can get our transportation system optimised and in level with the competitiveness of our European city equivalents. And this is actually a truism that goes back to why do we need to relearn the lessons of 100 years ago. This has been a 40-year failed experiment in deregulation and privatisation of our public transport system. If we go back 100 years ago, it was actually a century ago last year that Glasgow first introduced motor buses under the corporation of the city. It was an apex in Glasgow's municipal socialism, which started with a public transport system. It was privately run to begin with in the 1870s with the Glasgow Street Tramways Act. It was a 22-year lease that a private operator could take on the tramway system, develop it in the city. Ultimately, the corporation of the city took it over in 1894 and then took over the Glasgow subway system in 1923. 1924 launched a motor bus service across the city. This was 30 routes covering over 100 miles, serving over 50 million people a year. It was an amazing achievement. Scotland, Glasgow, a world leader in municipal public transportation. How have we let it get to this, where we are now a laggard in the UK rather than a leader? Happy to give way. Yeah.
Minister. Member, how many cars were on the road then and how many cars are on the road now?
Paul Sweeney.
That makes a very important point. Relatively speaking, yes, the private car has taken a significant share of that overall movement of people around the city region. But it is important to note in that point about social justice that Glasgow remains a city with the lowest car ownership in the UK. Only 41% of Glaswegians own a car. So it accentuates the social injustice across Glasgow. And for all the concessionary travel schemes that have been introduced, it's not much use if the bus service doesn't actually function. So that is why we need to address this. And to the points about members across the chamber relaying the umpteen services that have been curtailed, reduced, cut altogether across the city, certainly many in my time as representing Glasgow, the 65 through the Calton out to Cambuslang, only the latest example of these cuts, whereby ultimately it's debasing for a democratic elected parliamentarian to have to go and beg a private company to sustain a public service. It's not good enough. We need to have public accountability, and that starts with control of the fare box through a franchise system. And also would address the fact that Glasgow's bus fares are the most expensive of any British city. A single is now £2.85 compared to £2 on Edinburgh's publicly owned Lothian buses and £1.75 on Transport for London services. It's simply not fair that Glaswegians are subject to this private rent extraction and private profit extraction when that money can be reinvested in subsidies for loss-making routes and help to sustain coherence across the whole network. We don't even know what routes make money and what routes lose money. We can't plan coherently. I've got a map on my wall in my office of Glasgow's bus services and Glasgow's tram services in 1938. We knew what they were, we knew where they were, how they performed. There were night buses, there were night trams, there were late-night subway services. Subways ran on a Sunday. We had a fully integrated transport system. How we let it unravel? I urge the Minister to hear the pleas from the people representing our city, great city of Glasgow, fix our transport system and let Glasgow flourish once again. Thank you.
Thank you. Before calling the next speaker, I am conscious of the number of members who do still want to participate in this debate, and therefore I am minded to accept a motion under Rule 8.14.3 to extend the debate by up to 30 minutes. I call on Patrick Harvey to move such a motion.
I didn't expect to have to on the last day of term, but I'm happy to move.
An achievement, I think, undoubtedly. The question is that the debate be extended by up to 30 minutes. Are we all agreed? That is agreed, and I call John Mason to be followed by Monica Lennon. Up to 4 minutes. Mr Mason.
Thank you very much, and I thank Patrick Harvey for bringing this motion. And I certainly agree with the bulk of it, and especially that we should have high-quality, affordable and reliable bus services and integrated ticketing. I would just say to him that as far as knowing when a bus comes, the First Bus app in Glasgow is very good, and you can actually tell where the bus is at a particular point of time. As a councillor, I was a member of SPT for a number of years, and I'm a strong supporter of them as an organisation. I think it's good that we can look at public transport from a wider perspective rather than just individual council areas, and especially in Strathclyde, where so many people travel into Glasgow for work, study, retail and leisure purposes. However, I do think we need to tread a little cautiously on both public ownership of buses and franchising. Broadly speaking, I support public ownership and potentially franchising, but neither of these is a magic bullet in itself. I grew up with Glasgow Corporation operating buses within the city and SMT and others running services outside the city boundaries. And the system was not perfect at that time. There were regular complaints that areas voting strongly Labour, like Castlemilk, got a better bus service than areas which voted in different ways. So public ownership does not guarantee major improvements. ScotRail may have marginally improved under public control. Yes?
Bob Doris.
I won't take the debate on whether Labour areas get better bus services, but in my speech, Mr Mason, I was making the point that those with the loudest voices, the most organised campaigns, may get the better services, because politicians are quite attuned to represent constituents who make the strongest case, but they might not always have the biggest social need.
John Mason.
Yeah, well, if his point is that there's a risk under public ownership as well, I certainly do agree with that. ScotRail may have marginally improved under public control, but there's been no sudden dramatic increase in services, pay for staff or reduction in fares. All of these improvements, which are desirable, even necessary, as others have said, cost money whoever owns and operates the bus network. If we want buses running through the night more frequently in rural areas or doing circular routes in the cities, all of that I would support, but we do need to be realistic and accept that it will take more taxpayers' money, which presumably means higher taxes. I personally support that, but I realise not everyone does. If it's brief, yes, please.
I thank the member for giving me. It makes an important point. I think it's important to recognise that around 45% of bus company turnover is already public subsidy, and the issue is that we can't actually visualise where the money's been made and where the money's been lost, so we can't cross-subsidise in a coherent way, and that would be through control of the fare box. Would you agree that that would be a logical solution?
John Mason.
I certainly agree we need more information. I have asked, for example, first about the 65 bus and how many passengers they have, and as far as I'm aware, we don't get that information. I think we also have to be cautious about comparing Glasgow and Edinburgh. Buses in Edinburgh have a virtual monopoly on public transport, together with the trams, obviously, whereas in Glasgow we have an excellent local rail system, which for many people is much more fast, convenient and comfortable than buses will ever be. Glasgow has some 72 rail stations, including 15 in the subway, and in my own constituency we have 11 rail stations. A train from Easterhouse to the city centre takes about 15 minutes, whereas the number 2 bus, doing a similar route from Baillieston, takes 40 minutes. Admittedly, the bus is cheaper, free in fact for those of us who are over 60 or under 22, but with a rail card the train is £2.95 return, which is not so bad. However, buses stop much more frequently and therefore are more convenient for going to local shops, the GP, chemist, school or similar. So we definitely need both trains and buses, but to some extent, at least, they are competing with each other. This competition has been a particular challenge for a village like Carmyle in my constituency. The train service improved dramatically when the Whifflet line was electrified, and services now run through the Argyll line. Partly as a result of that, bus usage to and from Carmyle has declined. So not surprisingly, the bus service has been reduced too, and that leads to complaints for those who really do need the bus for more local journeys which the trains cannot provide. But usage in the west of Scotland has been in decline for many years, and it is not exactly clear how that can be changed. Most recently, as others have mentioned, First have announced it is dropping the number 65 route because of poor patronage, despite the fact this is a vital route for some people, including Bridgeton Main Street in my constituency. We also face the challenge that many people still want to use cars. That can be for a variety of reasons, including convenience, starting or finishing work when there is little public transport, feeling safer, working out of town location and so on. And finally, there's the question of cost of a franchise system. I understand the subsidy in London is around £700 million per year, which is about £80 per head of population. So yes, I'm supportive of the direction of travel, but someone is going to have to pay the bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Mason. I now call Monica Lennon to be followed by Ross Greer. Up to 4 minutes, Ms Lennon.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thank you to Patrick Harvey for making us all stay late. No, seriously, thank you for securing this important debate on the future of Glasgow's bus services. The issues raised in his motion impact my constituents in Central Scotland too, and I know that members right across the chamber are passionate about improving bus services in our communities, as we've heard in the thoughtful speeches tonight, even though I think people are a little bit on the tired side this evening. But I hope for the Minister that he feels energised hearing that colleagues, regardless of party or where we sit in the chamber do feel very strongly and want to work together on solutions. No one wants to live in a bus desert. I know that Graeme Simpson has disappeared from the screen, but he did highlight that very real concern that many of us have, and it is becoming a reality for too many communities. And bus desert has appeared in the official report now in Parliament too many times for my liking. As a member of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee, I'm keenly aware of both the challenges and opportunities facing decision makers, and I want to join colleagues in paying tribute to Get Glasgow Moving for the Better Buses for Strathclyde campaign, which is supported by more than 12,000 people across the region and counting. And to thank Ellie Harrison and all the volunteer campaigns, because they do this in their own time, and I'm sure at times it is very stressful and tiring, but that lived experience is so valuable. Mark Ruskell and others have addressed some of the challenges around the franchising process and some of the barriers that have been raised, but I think as colleagues who have talked about bus services and routes that they care about, including Bob Doris, but Claire Hawkey and other colleagues have mentioned the 65 route, which is operated by First Bus at the moment, and it just makes me think back to the experience we had in Hamilton with the X1 bus service, which I know the Minister and other colleagues have heard me talk about a lot. And again, with First Bus, there was a real lack of consultation, a lack of transparency and accountability, and a lack of responsibility to what is in the public interest. So I know through community efforts, people didn't give up around the X1. And I want to pay tribute to GMB Travel, who are a small operator, but they did see the opportunity, they did see the public's demand and need for that service, and an X1 service has been resurrected. We now have a fast route again through Hamilton into town centre and into Glasgow city centre. But it shouldn't just take a bit of luck and hard work from communities, and not everyone has that capacity and that resilience. So all these... Yes, of course.
Very briefly, Paul Sweeney.
As a former urban planner, my colleague will get this, that the ability to join up rail services, subway services and bus services really undermines how the whole system can operate efficiently, and that's part of the problem.
Monica Lennon.
Absolutely, we need to have a spatial approach, we need to have a joined-up approach. I think the political will is here on MSP benches. We need the government to really step up, because as we've heard from Get Glasgow Moving, and well, the Minister shakes his head, and I'm happy to... You're not intervening. We've seen the contrast in England, where the Chancellor has announced, I think, more than 15 billion to transform public transport in those regions that are committed to bus franchising. There is a real danger that Scotland is going to lag behind. So it's really great that we have communities backed by their MSPs and MPs, such as the one in Rutherglen with the 65. I know that as well as Michael Shanks with his petition, there's John Grady in Glasgow East. And it's great we can work cross-party, but we do need that leadership from the Scottish Government. As others have made, it is about the social justice aspect, the environmental issues and the economy. So this can be a win-win-win. We can get this right for Scotland's people, environment and economy. And in my final seconds, Presiding Officer, just to say, I hope the Minister will address the very important issue about school transport as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We come to the final speaker in the open debate, Ross Greer. Up to 4 minutes, Mr Greer.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And like colleagues, can I thank Patrick Harvie for securing this debate and his long-standing commitment to campaigning for quality bus services. I remember when I was first elected in 2016 how advantageous it was that I could borrow some of the props that Mr Harvie had produced over many years of campaigning for local services. His novelty bus conductor's hat and novelty bus stop have proven very useful for various local photo opportunities with campaign groups over the years. And I'm glad we're having this debate because, as Paul Sweeney reflected, this has been a 40-year-long disastrous experiment in privatisation for our bus services. And it results in the public paying twice. You pay once when you pay for your ticket on the bus, but we're all paying a second time through taxation to subsidise essential services that private operators are not interested in running unless they receive a public subsidy to do so. And I want to share a couple of examples from either end of my region. John Mason was making the point about Strathclyde being seen as a region in this regard, and how that makes sense, particularly given how much of it operates around Glasgow. The first example is from Skelmerley, where a constituent of mine, Cameron, he's 89 and he needs to go to Crosshouse Hospital on a regular basis for treatment for his Crohn's. He needs to take 4 buses to get there. He needs a local bus within Skelmerley, then Skelmerley to Largs, Largs to Irvine, and then a 4th bus from Irvine to the hospital. And that's with 2 different operators. Now, obviously, in that case, 4 buses is a significant barrier to him. But on top of that, if somebody was between the ages of 22 and 59 and was having to pay for their bus tickets, there'd be no opportunity to get even a day ticket for that because it's 2 different operators. But that's 8 buses that he needs to take just to get to and from his regular medical appointment. And there are areas where some progress has been made, largely driven by the free bus travel for young people that the Scottish Greens secured. 2 services in my area run by West Coast Motors, the 15 and the 17 that run from Dundalk and Mulgai into Glasgow city centre, have had their timetables significantly expanded in recent years because of the increased patronage from young people, primarily young people going to college and university in the city. But when the 17's timetable was improved, that resulted in 2 other bus services in Dundalk being withdrawn completely. McCall's withdrew the 6B and the 118, and not because the 17's increased timetable was a like-for-like comparison to them. It left a number of my constituents without the services that they needed. Sandra, who's a nurse in Dundalk, works at the Gartnavel, now has an extra 90 minutes on her journey to get to the hospital. And anybody who lives anywhere near the area will know that the distance between Dundalk and Gartnavel is not a large one, and an extra 90 minutes on a journey before and after a 12.5-hour shift as a nurse is a significant challenge. And just as one final example of this, because it's one that will come into effect this Saturday, McCall's have just announced that they're withdrawing the 340 service. That runs from Helensburgh in the Vale of Leven to the Royal Alexandria Hospital in Paisley. That service was introduced when services at the Vale of Leven Hospital were transferred to the Royal Alexandria. And I sympathise with the Health Board, who subsidised that service. They subsidised it using charitable funding that's no longer available to them. They're now providing their own direct service, but it's only for staff and patients, not patients' companions, unless it's a formal companion for someone with a recognised disability, and it's not for visitors. For a visitor, there is now going to be an expensive, long, multi-operator journey to get from Helensburgh or the Vale of Leven to the Royal Alexandria, where many of the services for these constituents reside. Can I suggest you just need to be winding up, Mr. I'll just wind up on that point. My apologies to Mr. Sweeney. It's just another example of fragmentation. It's going to result in more cars on the road during a climate emergency and more isolation for those without a car. So I would ask the Minister if he can respond to the calls in this debate and the calls of campaigners to really act with urgency on this. This would be a transformation for the economies, not just of our cities, but particularly of our rural areas. It would be transformational for social justice and for public health to tackle many of our local air pollution issues. It is a win-win. It's exactly the kind of preventative spend we're talking about, and it is exactly the kind of transformation that our constituents are crying out for. Thank you. I now invite the Minister to respond to the debate. Around 7 minutes, Minister.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And I genuinely want to thank Patrick Harvey for bringing this debate to the Chamber today and allow us to discuss the opportunity that we have in front of us. And I have to say, I apologise for my frustration to Monica Lennon. It is late in the session, it is late in the day. But I think the Scottish Government has done a lot, and we're continuing to do a lot, and we're absolutely committed to doing as much as we can, because we are absolutely all in agreement in the Chamber that bus is an essential service, not only providing access for people to the services and the facilities that they need, but also in tackling the climate emergency. The services play a vital role in delivering the First Minister's 4 priorities: eradicating child poverty, growing the economy, tackling the climate emergency and improving Scotland's bus services. Since January 2022, there has been over 225 million bus journeys have been made across Scotland by children and young people using their under-22 free bus entitlement card. That's helping them and their family cut costs for essential leisure and travel. In December 2024, the Child Poverty Action Group reported that free bus travel can save a child in Scotland up to £2,836 annually. So it's getting to the point. I absolutely take the points that have been made right across the Chamber. I'll give away.
Monica Lennon, briefly.
grateful to the Minister, and of course I accept his apology. I understand why he feels frustrated. It's been a long week, but doesn't he agree it's even more frustrating for people who are relying on bus services? Buses either don't turn up, they can't afford them, or the routes are under threat. We've heard about the 65. Ross Greer's given a very powerful example as well. What will the Minister do to tackle those issues and give people some hope?
Minister.
I'll continue to use my time to get through as much of my speech as I possibly can, because there's an awful lot of the questions that have been asked in here will be contained in what I'm going to say. Across Scotland, there's over 2 million children, young people and disabled and older people are now benefiting from free bus travel, making over 3 million journeys a week. But we want more people to be travelling by public transport for work, to study and to leisure, and to help local transport authorities improve bus provision in their area. We've delivered the legislation providing them with powers on partnership working, run their own services and bus franchising. And I'm encouraged that authorities across Scotland are exploring these powers, including the SPT. Now, I'm going to point out one thing that has been mentioned a couple of times, and that is the issue around the panel. SPT have previously highlighted their concerns with the franchising panel, which I absolutely accept. But they've also said they wrote to the Citizens Petition Public Petitions Committee, and they said in that assurance, they are seeking assurance that any change would not materially impact on the timeline required to undertake a franchise assessment, nor introduce additional risks to any authority considering franchising as a means of improving bus networks for the travelling public in Scotland. And if we go back to square one, which is what would be required, that's exactly what will happen. So we are on the journey that we're on. We're having to do it together. And I see Patrick Harvey shaking his head. I apologise that you don't like that answer, but that is the position that we are in. The panels were put there in primary legislation in 2019 Act, so therefore they have to be followed through.
Briefly, Patrick Harvey.
I wonder if the Minister would just accept as a point of fact that the situation down south is so much easier because it doesn't have that unnecessary step which adds nothing of value to the process. Surely we should be making this as quick, simple and easy for SBT and others as we possibly can.
Minister.
Well, there's a couple of points there. He's saying it adds nothing to the service. It actually does, because it adds robustness to the franchising process. It makes sure that everybody who's required to be... Claire Hawkey talked earlier on about whether or not passengers can have a say in what's happening in their services. Franchising gives us that. When they go through that process of franchising, the panel, the final robustness of that system is that the panel will make sure that everything has been done. The systems that have been carried out in England, they were the ones that I assume Mr Harvey is talking about that haven't worked or that was refused, was on the basis of a financial issue only. It didn't look at the entirety of the service. So the system that was put in place by members in this chamber in 2019, they put the robustness in place, and it's now in primary legislation, which is why there is a panel required. That's why we are where we are. Well, I'm not going to get through all the other things we're going to talk about, yes, but I'm happy...
Very briefly, Paul Sweeney.
Would the Minister recognise the concerns raised by SPT, where they say that the panel could demand or reject the proposal or require changes which cause significant delay, with the latter triggering a renewed cycle of the franchising framework and assessment process? Can you give some reassurance, at least, of how that will be managed?
Minister. I can't give a reassurance that the panel will accept the franchise unless the people who are pulling the franchise together do it in such a robust way that it will not be rejected. So there's something in the psyche for SPT. Now, I've met SPT on a couple of occasions. We've had this conversation, and that robustness that they will have to put into their process, they're very well aware of it, which would give me confidence to say that they'll get their franchise through, because they know that every single every single I has to be dotted and every T crossed, as a result of having that panel there in the first place. Does somebody else want to intervene? No? OK. So I've absolutely no idea where we are in the speech now, but what I am going to say is I very much welcome Get Glasgow Moving in the Chamber. The work that they have done has been phenomenal. I've met them at least once, one unofficially and one officially. So I'm going to try to go back to we want more people travelling by public transport to work for study and leisure, and I'm encouraged that the authorities across Scotland are already exploring that. In addition, we're investing more than £2.6 billion in 25 and 26 to support public transport and make the transport system affordable, more available and accessible for all, and we're increasing our funding bus services and concession travel from £430 million to £465 million in years 24 to 25. Over the coming year, we'll provide almost £50 million to support bus services so operators can continue providing access to affordable transport. The LTAs also have a duty under their Transport Act to identify where the social needs for particular services can be subsidised at their discretion. To help them, we provide funding through the General Revenue Grant, and in 23 and 24 they spent £56 million subsidising essential services. As I said, several members have already been congratulating Get Glasgow Moving today, and I add to that. I did meet with them recently, and I encouraged that group's commitment to engaging with those local communities, going back to the point that Claire Hockey was making. That engagement with the bus services is absolutely essential, because I understand these are private companies, but they are serving the public. As I said, I've met SPT on a couple of occasions. So I'm going to ditch this altogether, Presiding Officer. What I am going to say is I absolutely share the frustration of members that are in the chamber tonight, that there is so much public funding put into this, and yet we do not have the say over when services are cut, what the routes are going to be, or any of the other things that we would genuinely hope to have as a public transport provider. But they are in a deregulated market. We have given the powers to local authorities. There are a number of examples where that is beginning to turn, and I guarantee that as long as I'm the Minister for Buses, I will be doing everything in my power to make sure that we make that service work for the people who are trying to use it. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister. That concludes the debate at the end of a long week. Can I congratulate members on making it to the bitter end? Can I wish you and staff as well a restful summer? And with that, I close this meeting of Parliament.